Hello friends, and welcome to this lecture on the American Constitution. This is the first of three series of lectures on the constitutional foundation of the American Republic, which is a fundamental central topic in any course on American politics and American government. In fact, you really can't understand American politics or really American history unless you've looked at the development of the Constitution. And as budding students of political science and American government looked at the actual framework and the contents and the changes that have taken place in our understanding and interpretation of the Constitution. So today's lecture will be on those aspects of the Constitution that are the most enduring, and some of perhaps best entitled The Contributions of the American Constitution over time. First of all, we want to begin to talk about this notion of the Constitution within the American social and political experience. The framers of the Constitution simply wanted, as the Constitution itself says, to build a more perfect union, to create a government that would correct some of the mistakes, overcome some of the limitations of previous systems of government that they had experienced, and rectify those to provide for more liberty. Liberty is a central theme in the creation of the Constitution. Let's begin by talking about what a Constitution is. We know from earlier in this class that it comes from the Latin constitutio, meaning the law. But more importantly and more dramatically in terms of our study, the Constitution is the mode in which a state or government is organized. In the 21st century, almost all systems of government, all political entities, say that they have a constitution. Often not written by representative groups of citizens, but by some other authoritarian or totalitarian element in that political system. Still, the Constitution has almost a sacred ring to it, and that's what makes it so important. The Constitution is also how, at least in the American context, how sovereignty, and by sovereignty, as we talked about earlier this semester, where ultimate power resides. That's what we mean by sovereignty. How sovereignty is divided or distributed. The American context is a unique one because we actually divide the power of government between the national and the state entities. A more traditional definition of a constitution is as the fundamental law of a country. The Constitution is the basis for all law and all judicial action and activity and arrangement. So it's kind of the fundamental principle. It's sort of the founding document of that country. Another definition of constitutions is as a set of laws for any country, and indeed that goes back to the very popular use of the term constitution in the 21st century. As we approach the study of the Constitution, we need to keep in mind that the American Constitution, which dates really from the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the ultimate ratification of the proposed Constitution, along with what we now call the Bill of Rights in 1789, it's often described as one of the greatest constitutions ever written. That's why we take it so seriously. And as budding students of politics, you're going to have to spend a lot of time looking, analyzing, and pondering the Constitution. Now, as an old political scientist, my devotion to the Constitution is very significant. And in my mind, most disputes over American politics and American government must be resolved based upon constitutional principles and interpretation. I even keep a pocket copy of the Constitution with me at all times. This is my worn, tattered copy of the Constitution. I think it might have even been amended once since I purchased this many years ago, and keep it in my pocket. You will find in Wilson and in the McClellan text copies of the Constitution. In fact, in the wonderful McClellan text, various versions of that Constitution. in terms of thinking about constitutions, one contribution of the American Constitution is that not all of it has to be written by. We usually think of the Constitution, as I just mentioned, as a formal written text, like I have in my hand at the moment, and as you have in your textbook. However, many times the best constitutions are those that exhibit the enduring qualities and principles of a people. So we talk about the possibility of an unwritten constitution. The British Constitution is often an example of such a sentiment. The entirety of the British Constitution is not contained in a single document, but in many documents and in ways of understanding those documents. For the American framers, the Constitution was most fundamentally an effort to provide order for a political system. Well, why would order be so important? One fundamental reason is that order is how we avoid chaos, how we avoid social disruption, political disruption. So the Constitution gives us a framework where we can pursue liberty, but with certain limitations. Now, the American experience is to have as few limitations as possible. And that's something for us to consider now and towards the end of the class when we look at civil rights and civil liberties. If you boil down all of these insights into a much more simple set of ideas, for the American founders and the American Constitution, liberty is fundamental. And liberty for the framers means the lack of coercion, the ability to follow your own desires, your own interests, in large part. Okay, second large issue for us to consider is what should be the goals of a constitution. And the American political tradition gives us some specific recommendations on what the goals of a constitution should be. So we've looked at sort of this idea of the American experience of the Constitution. Now we will return to the goals of the Constitution and see what the American political tradition contributes to that. First of all, in terms of goals, the Constitution should provide an example of stability and continuity. The creation of a political system is not all that unique, not all that perfect, but its ability to survive, especially the excitement and tumult of everyday life and the threats and promises that any regime has. Stability and continuity should be the goal. And that stability and continuity is possible because the people agree on certain values when it comes to politics and society. So they have a shared notion of values. Secondly, unlike many constitutions, our Constitution, in terms of aiding stability and continuity, does not guarantee prosperity. Some constitutions guarantee a level of wealth. The former Constitution of the Soviet Union guaranteed a certain level of income. Some other constitutions make similar claims. Our Constitution says if liberty is the primary goal, we can't guarantee that everybody's going to be rich. Everybody's going to necessarily always be happy. We have to contribute to creating a system that allows government to facilitate liberty and ultimately happiness as well. A second primary goal of a constitution from the American political and constitutional experience is for the political system to survive, for the country to prosper, the Constitution must restrain government. Government has, from the ancient world to the 21st century, the capacity, the tendency to take more and more power away from the citizenry, more and more rights away from the citizenry. And that government itself must be restrained. And the American framers' notion was the best source of restraint was in the fundamental document itself, the Constitution. So the Constitution plays a critical role in restraining government. Thirdly, and closely related to that, the Constitution gives us a framework where we hold public officials accountable. Those who we elect as our representatives, those who are part of the American government. The Constitution gives us a way of holding those officials accountable, which the founders believed was fundamental to protecting the American political system and also making government responsible. For example, if the President of the United States engages in illegal activity that is against the Constitution, against the wills and desires of the American people, the President is held accountable. The President can be impeached and the President can be removed. The same for any federal judge, any senior executive officer. And there are other ways of punishing and holding officials accountable. And the Constitution contains that language and those provisions. The next goal is a representative one. The Constitution represents the American people in a political and legal sense. Not one for one, or as the Supreme Court in Baker v. Carr described it, one man, one vote, one person, one vote, but it represents us as a political collective. It can't be exact, not necessarily perfect, but it does represent us. Next, we want to look at the limits of a constitution. What the American political experience suggests the Constitution has a great deal of trouble doing and should avoid trying to do, or perhaps should not even do at all. And again, we're basing this on the experience of the American Constitution. The first limit of a Constitution from American experience is that the Constitution can't do everything. It can't solve all our problems. It must be a statement of principle, what we often call first principles, of what is most important and most enduring in American political life, and what is just primary, what we can't do without. Secondly, the longer a constitution might be does not suggest how successful or worthwhile or thoughtful that constitution is. For example, we have in the United States, in the 21st century, some very long state constitutions. Many years ago, I was a fellow at a California college, and I had a chance to read the California Constitution, which has been changed a number of times since then. But while I was spending this summer fellowship at this institution, I read the California Constitution, which covered many more things than any other constitution I ever read. The problem is, it was about 125 pages long, as I remember. Almost no Californian I ever met had ever read that Constitution. It was too long. It tried to cover too many topics. It was too easily amendable. In a similar vein, in Alabama, where I taught and served as administrator, the Alabama Constitution had hundreds of amendments. Hundreds. And when I asked a former gentleman who was a former Assistant Attorney General of the state of Alabama, how do you make sense out of these amendments? He says, we don't. We just create a new amendment. Now that may be a little bit cynical, but it shows you a sign of the confusion if a constitution is too long and if it doesn't concentrate on first principles. Similarly, a limit of the Constitution in a very different way is it has to keep in mind that unwritten Constitution, those fundamental principles that guide the citizens of any country, in our case, the United States. Lastly, one of the limits of the Constitution is that it needs to be able to be changed at certain times. And we have Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, which allows us to amend it. And we've amended a number of times, and we're going to be talking about that in the next few lectures. We can change our Constitution. Shifting gears yet again to look at another aspect of the American constitutional experience is that the American Constitution does not stand as its own, as something new, ex nihilo, created out of the heavens. It is a compendium of a great deal of political insight and experience over many, many years. It's what the founders referred to often as the lamp of experience, the good practices of politics and government. And there were many sources for this document. The ancients, although the ancients weren't always viewed that positively by all of the founders, the many early modern thinkers, and the constitutions of the ancient world themselves had much insight, but they were criticized, for example, by some American founders like John Adams and James Monroe as not being particularly applicable to the American political experience. But some aspects of the ancient world that contributed to the founders' understanding of politics and society and ultimately the American Constitution was the notion of, and certainly in Greek political thought, of the polis, the Greek city-state, a small political entity where government power is best located closest to the source of the power. For example, the city-state was about 5,000 people. And if you had a complaint, you could easily resolve that. So the idea of local accountability, localism, is very central contribution of the ancient world that the founders would take seriously. Another example of the contribution of the ancient world to American constitutionalism is Rome's constitution. The notion of a constitution itself, and with all the goals and the limits that we've talked about already. And so Roman constitution, with its presumption that the Roman people would be virtuous, and also that there would be checks and balances on the government itself. The government couldn't do anything it wanted to. There'd be limits. And when it exceeded those limits, the people would hold the government in check. Most importantly, however, in the American political experience and the development of the American Constitution is the influence of England. It's important to keep in mind that in the 18th century, before the Declaration of Independence, and at all points before that, American citizens, especially in the 13 colonies, were, first of all, English citizens. We were English men and women first. The great influence upon the American founders and the American Constitution was the fact and the example of the British Constitution itself. Well, what was so special about that Constitution? One aspect of it that was very influential to the American founders was the notion of checks and balances. By checks and balances, I mean that the different parts of the government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, held each other accountable. And if they were to exceed their power, they could be stopped by one of the other branches. This is very fundamental to American politics today, and it will be for the remainder of your lives. A second notion of the political insights of the British that influenced the American Constitution was the notion of common law. That's often described as judge-made law. Anytime there is a legal case, judges have the opportunity to offer opinions if that case is appealed to a particular court. The collection of those judges' opinions over periods of time established this notion of common law, that there was a way to think about resolving disputes, solving problems. And so that common understanding becomes the common law. We don't have to start over again. Also, in a different manner, the British Constitution and the British political experience established certain political and legal norms under which the American political system and our judicial system would operate. As you'll notice now and in the subsequent lectures, there are a number of pivotal documents that are very influential to American political development and the development of the Constitution. The Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, the English Petition of Rights. McClellan, as the reading suggests, talk about this a great deal, and in the course of this brief lecture, I don't have the opportunity to analyze them at great length. But in your reading and preparation, you'll have the opportunity to do that. And many of these documents show how ultimate power is to be resisted, how government power itself is to be restrained. Another aspect of the British contribution is the notion of the law of the land, due process, that everybody has their hearing, everybody has a right to be heard, and that if you have a dispute with your neighbor or with the government, you're allowed to have that dispute resolved in a fair and equitable manner. Another key aspect of the English contribution to the American Constitution and American politics is the importance of Parliament. Now, we don't call our national legislature, of course, Parliament. We call it Congress, made up of the House of Representatives, the number 435, in the 21st century, and the Senate that numbers 100, two per state. Very different institutions that we'll be talking about a great deal about later in the semester. But the Parliament becomes the pivotal English political institution. And it is obviously the founders' preference in terms of what institution in American public life would be the most important and make the most decisions. My friends, lastly, there's the connection between education and citizenship. In terms of the American experience of the Constitution, the founders and subsequent generations of Americans have valued the notion of an informed citizenry. That for the country to prosper, the American citizens would have to be the primary decision makers in one way or another, and that the survival of the Republic depended upon a well-educated and indeed virtuous citizenry. This gives us some background on the larger concepts at play in the developing American Constitution. In Constitutional Foundations 2 and Constitutional Foundations 3, lectures and readings and ruminations, we'll look at more of this great document and its importance and central role in American political life, the U.S. Constitution. Thank you.